A journal of the plague year, being observations or memorials of the most remarkable occurrences, as well public as private, which happened in London during the last great visitation in 1665, written by a citizen who continued all the while in London, never made public before. It was about the beginning of September 1664 that I, among the rest of my neighbours, heard in ordinary discourse that the plague was returned again in Holland, for it had been very violent there, and particularly at Amsterdam and Rotterdam in the year 1663, whither they say it was brought, some said from Italy, others from the Levant, among some goods that were brought home by their Turkey fleet. Others said it was brought from Candia, others from Cyprus. It mattered not whence it came, but all agreed it was come into Holland again. We had no such thing as printed newspapers in those days to spread rumours and reports of things, and to improve them by the invention of men, as I have lived to see practised since. But such things as these were gathered from the letters of merchants and others who corresponded abroad, and from them was handed about by word of mouth only, so that things didn't spread instantly over the whole nation as they do now. But it seems that the government had a true account of it, and several councils were held about ways to prevent its coming over, but all was kept very private. Hence it was that this rumour died off again, and people began to forget it as a thing we were very little concerned in, and that we hoped was not true, till the latter end of November or the beginning of December 1664, when two men, said to be Frenchmen, died of the plague in Long Acre, or rather at the upper end of Drury Lane. The family they were in endeavoured to conceal it as much as possible, but as it had gotten some vent in the discourse of the neighbourhood, the secretaries of state got knowledge of it, and concerning themselves to inquire about it, in order to be certain of the truth, 2 physicians and a surgeon were ordered to go to the house and make inspection. This they did, and finding evident tokens of the sickness upon both the bodies that were dead, they gave their opinions publicly that they died of the plague. Whereupon it was given in to the parish clerk, and he also returned them to the hall, and it was printed in the weekly bill of mortality in the usual manner thus: Plague 2, parishes infected 1. The people showed a great concern at this, and began to be alarmed all over the town, and the more because in the last week of December 1664 another man died in the same house, and of the same distemper. And then we were very easy again for about 6 weeks, when none having died with any marks of infection, it was said that the distemper was gone. But after that, I think it was about the 12th of February, another died in another house, but in the same parish and in the same manner. This turned the people's eyes pretty much towards that end of the town, and the weekly bills showing an increase of burials in St. Giles's parish more than usual, it began to be suspected that the plague was among the people at that end of the town, and that many had died of it, though they had taken care to keep it as much from the knowledge of the public as possible. This possessed the heads of the people very much, and few cared to go through Drury Lane or the other streets suspected, unless they had extraordinary business that obliged them to it. This increase of the bills stood thus: the usual number of burials in a week in the parishes of St. Giles in the Fields and St. Andrew's, Holborn, were from 12 to 17 or 19 each, few more or less. But from the time that the plague first began in St. Giles's parish, it was observed that the ordinary burials increased in number considerably. For example, from December the 27th to January the 3rd, 1665, St. Giles's had 16 and St. Andrew's had 17 burials. From January the 3rd to the 10th, St. Giles's had 12, St. Andrew's 25. The next week, St. Giles 18, St. Andrew's 28. The week after that, St. Giles 23 and 16, and so forth. The like increase of the bills was observed in the parishes of St. Bride's, adjoining on one side of Holborn parish, and in the parish of St. James Clerkenwell, adjoining on the other side of Holborn. In both which parishes, the usual number that died weekly were from 4 to 6 or 8, whereas at that time they were increased as follows: December 27th to January the 3rd, St. Bride's 6, St. James's 9. January the 3rd to the 10th, St. Bride's 11, St. James's 7. January the 10th to the 17th, St. Bride's 12, St. James 9 burials. and so on. Besides this, it was observed with great uneasiness by the people that the weekly bills in general increased very much during these weeks, although it was at a time of the year when usually the bills are very moderate. The usual number of burials within the bills of mortality for a week was from about 240 or thereabouts to 300. The last was esteemed a pretty high bill. But after this, we found the bills successively increasing as followed. December the 27th to the 3rd of January, 349. January the 3rd to January the 10th, 394. January the 10th to the 17th, 415. January the 17th to the 24th, 474. This last bill was really frightful, being a higher number than had been known to have been buried in 1 week since the preceding visitation of 1656. However, all this went off again, and the weather proving cold and the frost, which began in December, still continuing very severe, even till near the end of February, attended with sharp though moderate winds, the bills decreased again, and the city grew healthy, and everybody began to look upon the danger as good as over, only that still the burials in St. Giles continued high. From the beginning of April especially, they stood at 25 each week, till the week from the 18th to the 25th, when there was buried in St. Giles's parish 30, whereof 2 of the plague and 8 of the spotted fever, which was looked upon as the same thing. Likewise, the number that died of the spotted fever in the whole increased, being 8 the week before, and 12 the week above named. This alarmed us all again, and terrible apprehensions were among the people, especially the weather being now changed and growing warm, and the summer being at hand. However, the next week there seemed to be some hopes again. The bills were low. The number of the dead in all was but 388. There was none of the plague, and but 4 of the spotted fever. But the following week it returned again, and the distemper was spread into 2 or 3 other parishes, specifically St. Andrew's, Holborn, St. Clement, Danes, and to the great affliction of the city, 1 died within the walls in the parish of St. Mary Woolchurch, that is to say, in Bearbinder Lane, near Stocks Market. In all, there were 9 of the plague and 6 of the spotted fever. It was, however, upon inquiry, found that this Frenchman who died in Bearbinder Lane was one who, having lived in Longacre near the infected houses, had removed for fear of the distemper, not knowing that he was already infected. This was the beginning of May, yet the weather was temperate, variable, and cool enough, and people had still some hopes. That which encouraged them was that the city was healthy. The whole 97 parishes buried but 54, and we began to hope that, as it was chiefly among the people at that end of the town, it might go no farther. And the rather because the next week, which was from the 9th of May to the 16th, there died but 3, of which not 1 within the whole city or liberties. And St. Andrew's buried but 15, which was very low. 'Tis true, St. Giles's buried 2 and 30, but still, as there was but 1 of the plague, people began to be easy. The whole bill also was very low, for the week before the bill was but 347, and the week above mentioned but 343. We continued in these hopes for a few days, but it was but for a few, for the people were no more to be deceived thus. They searched the houses, and found that the plague was really spread every way, and that many died of it every day, so that now all our extenuations abated, and it was no more to be concealed. Nay, it quickly appeared that the infection had spread itself beyond all hopes of abatement, that in the parish of St. Giles it was gotten into several streets, and several families lay all sick together, and accordingly, in the weekly bill for the next week, the thing began to show itself. There was indeed but 14 set down of the plague, but this was all knavery and collusion, for in St. Giles's parish they buried 40 in all, whereof it was certain most of them died of the plague, though they were set down of other distempers, and though the number of all the burials were not increased above 32, and the whole bill being but 385, yet there was 14 of the spotted fever, as well as 14 of the plague, and we took it for granted upon the whole that there were 50 died that week of the plague. The next bill was from the 23rd of May to the 30th, when the number of the plague was 17, but the burials in St. Giles's were 53, a frightful number, of whom they set down but 9 of the plague. But on an examination more strictly by the justices of peace, and at the Lord Mayor's request, it was found there were 20 more who were really dead of the plague in that parish, but had been set down of the spotted fever or other distempers, besides others concealed. But those were trifling things to what happened immediately after, for now the weather set in hot, and from the first week in June the infection spread in a dreadful manner, and the bills rose high. The articles of fever, spotted fever, and teeth began to swell, for all that could conceal their distempers did it, to prevent their neighbours shunning and refusing to converse with them, and also to prevent authority shutting up their houses, which, though it was not yet practised, yet was threatened, and people were extremely terrified at the thoughts of it. The second week in June, the parish of St. Giles, where still the weight of the infection lay, buried 120, whereof, though the bills said but 68 of the plague, everybody said there had been 100 at least, calculating it from the usual number of funerals in that parish, as above. Till this week, the city continued free, there having never any died except that one Frenchman whom I mentioned before, within the whole 97 parishes. Now there died 4 within the city, 1 in Wood Street, 1 in Fenchurch Street, and 2 in Crooked Lane. Southwark was entirely free, having not 1 yet died on that side of the water. I lived without Aldgate, about midway between Aldgate Church and Whitechapel Bars, on the left-hand or north side of the street, and as the distemper had not reached that side of the city, our neighbourhood continued very easy. But at the other end of the town, their consternation was very great, and the richer sort of people, especially the nobility and gentry from the west part of the city, thronged out of town with their families and servants in an unusual manner, and this was more particularly seen in Whitechapel, that's to say, the Broad Street where I lived. Indeed, nothing was to be seen but wagons and carts with goods, women, servants, children, etc., coaches filled with people of the better sort, and horsemen attending them, and all hurrying away. Then empty wagons and carts appeared, and spare horses with servants, who, it was apparent, were returning or sent from the countries to fetch more people, beside innumerable numbers of men on horseback, some alone, others with servants, and, generally speaking, all loaded with baggage, and fitted out for travelling, as anyone might perceive by their appearance. This was a very terrible and melancholy thing to see, and as it was a sight which I could not but look on from morning to night, for indeed there was nothing else of moment to be seen, it filled me with very serious thoughts of the misery that was coming upon the city, and the unhappy condition of those that would be left in it. This hurry of the people was such for some weeks that there was no getting at the Lord Mayor's door without exceeding difficulty. There was such pressing and crowding there to get passes and certificates of health for such as travelled abroad, for without these there was no being admitted to pass through the towns upon the road, or to lodge in any inn. Now, as there had none died in the city for all this time, my Lord Mayor gave certificates of health without any difficulty to all those who lived in the 97 parishes, and to those within the liberties too for a while. This hurry, I say, continued some weeks, that's to say, all the month of May and June, and the more because it was rumoured that an order of the government was to be issued out to place turnpikes and barriers on the road to prevent people travelling, and that the towns on the road wouldn't suffer people from London to pass for fear of bringing the infection along with them, though neither of these rumours had any foundation but in the imagination, especially at first. I now began to consider seriously with myself concerning my own case, and how I should dispose of myself, that's to say, whether I should resolve to stay in London, or shut up my house and flee, as many of my neighbours did. I've set this particular down so fully because I know not but it may be of moment to those who come after me, if they come to be brought to the same distress, and to the same manner of making their choice. And therefore I desire this account may pass with them rather for a direction to themselves to act by, than a history of my actings, seeing it may not be of 1 farthing value to them to note what became of me. I had 2 important things before me. The one was the carrying on of my business and shop, which was considerable, and in which was embarked all my effects in the world, and the other was the preservation of my life, in so dismal a calamity as I saw apparently was coming upon the whole city, and which, however great it was, my fears perhaps, as well as other people's, represented to be much greater than it could be. The first consideration was of great moment to me. My trade was a saddler, and as my dealings were chiefly not by a shop or chance trade, but among the merchants trading with the English colonies in America, so my effects lay very much in the hands of such. I was a single man, 'tis true, but I had a family of servants whom I kept at my business, had a house, shop, and warehouses filled with goods, and, in short, to leave them all as things in such a case must be left, that's to say, without any overseer or person fit to be trusted with them, had been to hazard the loss not only of my trade, but of my goods, and indeed of all I had in the world. I had an elder brother at the same time in London, and not many years before come over from Portugal, and advising with him, his answer was in 3 words, the same that was given in another case quite different. That is, specifically, "Master, save thyself." In a word, he was for my retiring into the country, as he resolved to do himself with his family, telling me what he had it seems heard abroad, that the best preparation for the plague was to run away from it. As to my argument of losing my trade, my goods, or debts, he quite confuted me. He told me the same thing which I argued for my staying, specifically, that I would trust God with my safety and health was the strongest repulse to my pretensions of losing my trade and my goods. For, says he, is it not as reasonable that you should trust God with the chance or risk of losing your trade, as that you should stay in so eminent a point of danger, and trust him with your life? I couldn't argue that I was in any strait as to a place where to go, having several friends and relations in Northamptonshire, whence our family first came from, and particularly I had an only sister in Lincolnshire, very willing to receive and entertain me. My brother, who had already sent his wife and 2 children into Bedfordshire, and resolved to follow them, pressed my going very earnestly, and I had once resolved to comply with his desires, but at that time could get no horse, for though it's true all the people didn't go out of the city of London, yet I may venture to say that in a manner all the horses did, for there was hardly a horse to be bought or hired in the whole city for some weeks. Once I resolved to travel on foot with one servant, and, as many did, lie at no inn, but carry a soldier's tent with us, and so lie in the fields, the weather being very warm, and no danger from taking cold. I say as many did, because several did so at last, especially those who'd been in the armies in the war, which had not been many years past. And I must needs say, speaking of second causes, had most of the people that travelled done so, the plague had not carried into so many country towns and houses as it was to the great damage, and indeed to the ruin, of abundance of people. But then my servant, whom I'd intended to take down with me, deceived me, and being frighted at the increase of the distemper, and not knowing when I should go, he took other measures and left me. So I was put off for that time, and one way or another, I always found that a point to go away was always crossed by some accident or other, so as to disappoint and put it off again. And this brings in a story which otherwise might be thought a needless digression, specifically about these disappointments being from heaven. I mention this story also as the best method I can advise any person to take in such a case, especially if he be one that makes conscience of his duty, and would be directed what to do in it, namely, that he should keep his eye upon the particular providences which occur at that time, and look upon them complexly as they regard one another, and as all together regard the question before him. And then, I think, he may safely take them for intimations from heaven of what is his unquestioned duty to do in such a case. I mean, as to going away from or staying in the place where we dwell, when visited with an infectious distemper. It came very warmly into my mind one morning, as I was musing on this particular thing, that as nothing attended us without the directional permission of divine power, so these disappointments must have something in them extraordinary, and I ought to consider whether it did not evidently point out or intimate to me that it was the will of heaven I should not go. It immediately followed in my thoughts that if it really was from God that I should stay, he was able effectually to preserve me in the midst of all the death and danger that would surround me, and that if I attempted to secure myself by fleeing from my habitation, and acted contrary to these intimations, which I believed to be divine, it was a kind of flying from God, and that he could cause his justice to overtake me when and where he thought fit. These thoughts quite turned my resolutions again, and when I came to discourse with my brother again, I told him that I inclined to stay and take my lot in that station in which God had placed me, and that it seemed to be made more especially my duty on account of what I've said. My brother, though a very religious man himself, laughed at what I'd suggested about its being an intimation from heaven, and told me several stories of such foolhardy people, as he called them, as I was, that I ought indeed to submit to it as a work of heaven if I had been any way disabled by distempers or diseases, and that then, not being able to go, I ought to acquiesce in the direction of him who, having been my maker, had an undisputed right of sovereignty in disposing of me, and that then there had been no difficulty to determine which was the call of his providence and which was not. But that I should take it as an intimation from heaven that I should not go out of the town, only because I couldn't hire a horse to go, or my fellow was run away that was to attend me, was ridiculous, since at that time I had my health and limbs, and other servants, and might with ease travel a day or two on foot, and having a good certificate of being in perfect health, might either hire a horse or take post on the road as I thought fit. Then he proceeded to tell me of the mischievous consequences which attended the presumption of the Turks and Mohammedans in Asia, and in other places where he'd been, for my brother, being a merchant, was a few years before, as I've already observed, returned from abroad, coming last from Lisbon, and how, presuming upon their professed predestinating notions, and of every man's end being predetermined and unalterably beforehand decreed, they would go unconcerned into infected places, and converse with infected persons, by which means they died at the rate of 10 or 15,000 a week, whereas the Europeans, or Christian merchants, who kept themselves retired and reserved, generally escaped the contagion. Upon these arguments my brother changed my resolutions again, and I began to resolve to go, and accordingly made all things ready. For in short, the infection increased round me, and the bills were risen to almost 700 a week, and my brother told me he'd venture to stay no longer. I desired him to let me consider of it but till the next day, and I would resolve. And as I had already prepared everything as well as I could do as to my business, and to whom to entrust my affairs with, I had little to do but to resolve. I went home that evening greatly oppressed in my mind, irresolute, and not knowing what to do. I'd set the evening wholly apart to consider seriously about it, and was all alone, for already people had, as it were by general consent, taken up the custom of not going out of doors after sunset, the reasons I shall have occasion to say more of by and by. In the retirement of this evening, I endeavoured to resolve, first, what was my duty to do, and I stated the arguments with which my brother had pressed me to go into the country, and I set against them the strong impressions which I had on my mind for staying, the visible call I seemed to have from the particular circumstance of my calling, and the care due to me for the preservation of my effects, which were, as I might say, my estate. Also, the intimations which I thought I had from heaven, that to me signified a kind of direction to venture, and it occurred to me that if I had what I might call a direction to stay, I ought to suppose it contained a promise of being preserved if I obeyed. This lay close to me, and my mind seemed more and more encouraged to stay than ever, and supported with a secret satisfaction that I should be kept. Add to this, that turning over the Bible which lay before me, and while my thoughts were more than ordinarily serious upon the question, I cried out, "Well, I don't know what to do, Lord, direct me," and the like. And at that juncture I happened to stop turning over the book at the 91st Psalm, and casting my eye on the 2nd verse, I read on to the 7th verse exclusive, and after that included the 10th, as follows: "I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I will trust. Surely He shall deliver thee from the snare of the fowler, and from the noisome pestilence. He shall cover thee with His feathers, and under His wings shalt thou trust. His truth shall be thy shield and buckler. Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night, nor for the arrow that flieth by day, nor for the pestilence that walketh in darkness, nor for the destruction that wasteth at noonday. 1,000 shall fall at thy side, and 10,000 at thy right hand, but it shall not come nigh thee. Only with thine eyes shalt thou behold and see the reward of the wicked, because thou hast made the Lord, which is my refuge, even the Most High, thy habitation. There shall no evil befall thee, neither shall any plague come nigh thy dwelling, etc. I scarce need tell the reader, from that moment I resolved that I would stay in the town, and casting myself entirely upon the goodness and protection of the Almighty, would not seek any other shelter whatever, and that, as my times were in His hands, He was as able to keep me in a time of the infection as in a time of health. And if He did not think fit to deliver me, still I was in His hands, and it was meet He should do with me as should seem good to Him. With this resolution I went to bed, and I was further confirmed in it the next day by the woman being taken ill with whom I'd intended to entrust my house and all my affairs. But I had a further obligation laid on me on the same side, for the next day I found myself very much out of order also, so that if I would have gone away, I couldn't, and I continued ill 3 or 4 days, and this entirely determined my stay. So I took leave of my brother, who went away to Dorking in Surrey, and afterwards fetched a round farther into Buckinghamshire or Bedfordshire, to a retreat he'd found out there for his family. It was a very ill time to be sick in, for if anyone complained, it was immediately said he had the plague, and though I had indeed no symptom of that distemper, yet, being very ill both in my head and in my stomach, I was not without apprehension that I really was infected. But in about 3 days I grew better. The 3rd night I rested well, sweated a little, and was much refreshed. The apprehensions of its being the infection went also quite away with my illness, and I went about my business as usual. These things, however, put off all my thoughts of going into the country, and with my brother also being gone, I had no more debate either with him or within myself on that subject. It was now mid-July, and the plague, which had chiefly raged at the other end of the town, and, as I said before, in the parishes of St. Giles, St. Andrew's, Holborn, and towards Westminster, began now come eastward towards the part where I lived. It was to be observed, indeed, that it didn't come straight on towards us, for the city, that's to say, within the walls, was indifferently healthy still, nor was it got then very much over the water into Southwark. For though there died that week 1,268 of all distempers, whereof it might be supposed above 600 died of the plague, yet there was but 28 in the whole city, within the walls, and but 19 in Southwark, Lambeth parish included. Whereas, in the parishes of St. Giles and St. Martin in the Fields alone, there died 421. But we perceived the infection kept chiefly in the out-parishes, which being very populous, and fuller also of poor, the distemper found more to prey upon than in the city, as I shall observe afterwards. We perceived, I say, the distemper to draw our way, specifically by the parishes of Clerkenwell, Cripplegate, Shoreditch, and Bishopsgate, which 2 last parishes, joining to Aldgate, Whitechapel, and Stepney, the infection came at length to spread its utmost rage and violence in those parts, even when it abated at the western parishes where it began. It was very strange to observe that in this particular week, from the 4th to the 11th of July, when, as I've observed, there died near 400 of the plague in the 2 parishes of St. Martin and St. Giles in the Field only, there died in the parish of Aldgate but 4, in the parish of Whitechapel 3, in the parish of Stepney but 1. Likewise, in the next week, from the 11th of July to the 18th, when the week's bill was 1,761, yet there died no more of the plague on the whole Southwark side of the water than 16. But this face of things soon changed, and it began to thicken in Cripplegate parish especially, and in Clerkenwell, so that by the 2nd week in August, Cripplegate parish alone buried 886, and Clerkenwell 155. Of the first, 850 might well be reckoned to die of the plague, and of the last, the bill itself said 145 of the plague. During the month of July, and while, as I've observed, our part of the town seemed to be spared in comparison to the west part, I went ordinarily about the streets, as my business required, and particularly went generally once in a day, or in 2 days, into the city, to my brother's house, which he'd given me charge of, and to see if it was safe. And having the key in my pocket, I used to go into the house and over most of the rooms to see that all was well. For though it be something wonderful to tell, that any should have hearts so hardened in the midst of such a calamity as to rob and steal, yet certain it is that all sorts of villainies, and even levities, and debaucheries, were then practised in the town as openly as ever. I won't say quite as frequently, because the numbers of people were many ways lessened. But the city itself now began to be visited too, I mean within the walls. But the number of people there were indeed extremely lessened by so great a multitude having gone into the country. And even all this month of July they continued to flee, though not in such multitudes as formerly. In August, indeed, they fled in such a manner that I began to think there would be really none but magistrates and servants left in the city. As they fled now out of the city, I should observe that the court removed early, specifically in the month of June, and went to Oxford, where it pleased God to preserve them. And the distemper did not, as I heard of, so much as touch them, for which I can't say that I ever saw they showed any great tokens of thankfulness, and hardly anything of reformation, though they didn't want being told that their crying vices might without breach of charity be said to have gone far in bringing that terrible judgment upon the whole nation. The face of London was now indeed strangely altered. I mean the whole mass of buildings, city, liberties, suburbs, Westminster, Southwark, and all together. For as to the particular part called the city, or within the walls, that was not yet much infected. But in the whole, the face of things, I say, was much altered. Sorrow and sadness sat upon every face, and though some parts were not yet overwhelmed, yet all looked deeply concerned. And as we saw it apparently coming on, so everyone looked on himself and his family as in the utmost danger. Were it possible to represent those times exactly to those that did not see them, and give the reader due ideas of the horror that everywhere presented itself, it must make just impressions upon their minds and fill them with surprise. London might well be said to be all in tears. The mourners didn't go about the streets, indeed, for nobody put on black or made a formal dress of mourning for their nearest friends. But the voice of mourners was truly heard in the streets. The shrieks of women and children at the windows and doors of their houses, where their dearest relations were perhaps dying or just dead, were so frequent to be heard as we passed the streets, that it was enough to pierce the stoutest heart in the world to hear them. Tears and lamentations were seen almost in every house, especially in the first part of the visitation, for towards the latter end men's hearts were hardened, and death was so always before their eyes that they didn't concern themselves for the loss of their friends, expecting that themselves should be summoned the next hour.